The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and quiet confidence. None of it mine. My brother-in-law sat at the far end of the table with his arms crossed, and a smirk he wasn't even trying to hide. My wife's attorney had a stack of folders arranged in front of him, like a man who already knew how the story ended. And my wife, the woman I had spent 11 years building a life with, sat beside her mother without once looking in my direction. Not out of shame, out of indifference. That was the part that stayed with me longest. I had driven 40 minutes through a November morning fog to sit in that room. The same fog that had been hanging over my life for about 2 years by then. The slow kind that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, and one morning you look around and realize you can't see anything clearly anymore. My father sat next to me. Retired electrician, 67 years old, hands that had seen real work. He'd driven up from Knoxville the night before and slept on my couch without complaint. When I'd tried to thank him that morning over burnt coffee and half a box of stale crackers, he just waved it off and told me to eat something. The attorney started talking. My wife's side of things first. The house in Bellevue, the contracting business I had built across 11 years and 3 states, primary custody of our son, the pension I'd been contributing to since I was 26, the joint accounts, the vacation property in the Smokies that we'd used exactly twice, but that her mother had always referred to as their cabin. I sat and listened. That was something I had always been good at, listening while other people talked. When the attorney finished, he set his pen down in a way that felt almost theatrical. My wife's mother exhaled slowly beside her. My brother-in-law uncrossed and recrossed his arms. My father leaned toward me. He didn't whisper dramatically. He just said it, quiet and flat, the way he used to tell me which circuit breaker to flip. Give them what they want. I looked at him. He didn't look back. He was staring at the table. Trust me, son. Give them what they want. Across the room, my wife finally glanced over. Just for a second. And what I saw on her face wasn't triumph. It was confusion. Because she had walked in expecting a fight, and my father had just handed her what looked like a surrender. What nobody in that room understood was that the real negotiation had ended 3 months earlier. My name is Ben Hartley. I grew up in Cookeville, Tennessee, the son of a man who believed in doing things right the first time, and not talking about it afterward. I am not a loud person. I don't walk into rooms and fill them up. I build things, literally, structurally, with permits and load-bearing calculations and years of earned licenses. And I take quiet satisfaction in work that holds up long after everyone stops paying attention to it. That quality served me well in business. It cost me something in my marriage. When I met my wife, I was 31. She was working with events coordination for a hotel chain downtown. We had 2 years of easy happiness before we got married. Dinners out, weekend trips, the kind of time together where you don't yet know each other's worst habits. The first year of marriage was fine. The second started shifting. Her family had money. Old Nashville money. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself, because it's been there long enough to be furniture. Her father had built a commercial real estate portfolio before I was born. Her brother had coasted into a VP title at the family firm, without, as far as I could tell, ever learning what the company actually did. And her mother, a woman who collected opinions the way other people collect porcelain, had decided early on that I was adequate. Not a great match for her daughter. Adequate. I was aware of that assessment from the beginning. I just didn't think it mattered. I was wrong about that. The disrespect didn't come all at once. It came the way water gets into old concrete. Slowly, through small gaps, until one day you press on the wrong spot and the whole thing crumbles. At family dinners, her brother would make comments about guys who work with their hands that he'd follow with a laugh before anyone could respond. Her mother once asked me, in front of 6 people, whether I'd ever considered doing something more scalable than contracting. My wife smiled into her wine glass. I noticed she'd stopped correcting them. I noticed she'd started agreeing, in the small, quiet ways that are harder to call out than outright agreement. A look held too long, a change of subject at the wrong moment. A laugh at a joke that wasn't quite a joke. I kept building the business. That was how I processed things, by working. We had our son when I was 34. For about 18 months after he was born, the marriage felt real again. We were tired and grateful in the same direction. Then we weren't. I don't know exactly when she started talking to the other man. I know when I found out, which was a Tuesday afternoon in February, 17 months before that conference room. I had left my phone charger at the office and driven back for it around 8:30 in the evening. The building was dark except for one light in the back office. I didn't think much of it. One of my project managers sometimes worked late. But the car in the lot wasn't his. I didn't go inside. I sat in my truck for 11 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when I pulled in and again when I pulled out. In between, I watched the light in the window and thought about the past 2 years with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. The man in that office was someone she'd introduced to me once at a fundraiser. He ran a development firm that had been quietly underbidding our commercial contracts for the better part of a year. I hadn't connected the two things before that night. I connected them sitting in a dark parking lot in February. I drove home. I didn't say anything. I called my attorney the next morning. The thing people don't understand about quiet men is that quietness isn't the same as passivity. I spent the next 4 months doing 3 things simultaneously. Running my business as normally as I could manage, being present for my son in every way I knew how, and building a case with the kind of methodical patience I usually reserved for complex structural projects. My attorney specialized in business divorces. She was the kind of person who asked questions that felt small until you realized they weren't. Early in our first meeting, she asked me to write down every piece of business information my wife had been exposed to over the years. Not just formally, but casually. Conversations overheard. Documents left on the kitchen table. Calls she'd been in the room for. Phone screens visible during dinner. That list got long. The pattern that emerged was not comfortable to look at. Over the previous 14 months, 3 of our commercial bids had been undercut by margins too precise to be coincidental. A subcontractor relationship I'd spent 2 years cultivating had quietly shifted its primary work to the other firm. A public contract we'd been shortlisted for, one we'd had every reason to expect, went to them instead, 2 weeks after my wife and I had discussed it over dinner. My attorney brought in a forensic accountant who reviewed communications, timestamps, and pricing histories. The picture that came together was not a smoking gun in any single document. It was a pattern of small leaks, each individually deniable, collectively devastating. I did not confront my wife. I had learned from watching her family that confrontation gives the other person time to prepare a response. Instead, I kept working. I renegotiated contracts. I restructured the business into a holding company with clear firewalls. I updated every client NDA. I had every sensitive project file moved to a system she had no access to. I documented my involvement in my son's life the way an attorney would. School pickups, pediatric appointments, teacher conferences, weekend routines, written down with dates. I was not angry. That surprised me at the time. I was focused, which is different. When she filed in the spring, her attorney's filings described me as emotionally unavailable and professionally obsessed. They were not entirely wrong about the second part. What they left out was why and when it had started. I did not rush to correct the record. There would be a time for that. Back in the conference room, after my father's words, there was a pause. My attorney slid a document across the table. A preliminary agreement I had already signed that morning, before walking in. My wife's attorney picked it up and started reading. The smirk on my brother-in-law's face held for about 45 seconds before something in his expression shifted. The agreement offered the house. It offered the vacation property. It offered several accounts she had specifically named in her filings. It offered a settlement structured so that her side would walk away feeling like they had gotten exactly what they came for. What it did not offer was the business, not in any form that actually mattered. 3 months earlier, my attorney had completed a corporate restructuring that reclassified the contracting company under a holding entity formed 18 months prior. The intellectual property, the client contracts, the licensing agreements, the proprietary bidding systems I'd built over a decade, all of it existed in a structure that predated her filing by long enough to be legally unassailable. Her attorney's claim to the business rested on an earlier valuation of an entity that, on paper, no longer existed in the same form. They had been aiming at something that had already moved. Her attorney asked for a recess. My wife's mother whispered something in her daughter's ear. My brother-in-law's arms were uncrossed now. He was leaning forward, saying something quietly to the attorney, and for the first time that morning he looked like a man doing math instead of celebrating. My father sat beside me without expression. When the room cleared for the break, he poured himself a cup of water from the carafe on the table and said, without looking up, "They'll figure it out in about 10 minutes. "I know," I said. "You okay?" I thought about it. "Yeah, I think I actually am." He nodded and drank his water. The resolution that followed wasn't cinematic. There were no dramatic speeches, no moments where someone slammed a folder on the table. The recess became a second recess. Her attorney made 2 phone calls in the hallway that I watched through the glass without being able to hear. The agreement was revised 3 times before the afternoon was over. She kept the house. She kept the vacation property and a portion of the joint accounts. She received a settlement that her family could present to the outside world as a win. What she walked away without. The business, the operating licenses, the client relationships, the decade of reputation I had built in 3 states, was everything that actually generated income. Her attorney, to his credit, understood what had happened. He said very little when it was over. just packed his folders and shook my attorney's hand with the look of a man who respected the move even if he wished he'd seen it coming. My wife and I didn't speak directly that day. We hadn't really spoken in months, but I caught her eyes once across the room as we were preparing to leave, and what I saw there wasn't anger. It was something harder to describe. The look of someone who has just realized that the story they were telling themselves was missing several chapters. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because the story is less useful if I pretend otherwise. What I felt walking to my truck in the November cold with my father beside me was something closer to exhausted relief. The kind of quiet that comes after a long period of sustained tension, when the source of the tension is finally gone. "Hungry?" my father asked. "Starving," I said. We went to a diner 2 miles from the courthouse and ate breakfast food at 4 in the afternoon, and neither of us talked about any of it for a long time. He had a short stack and 2 cups of coffee. I had eggs and toast and ate every bite, which I hadn't been able to do consistently in about 8 months. Eventually he said, "Your grandfather used to say something. He said the loudest man in the room is almost always losing." I thought about my brother-in-law in that conference room, arms crossed and smiling, certain of something he hadn't actually verified. He was right, I said. He usually was. The months that followed were quieter than I expected, and harder in ways I hadn't anticipated. Winning, if that's even the right word, doesn't erase the grief. The house I'd renovated a room at a time over 3 years went to someone else. The mountain property we'd talked about building on, the plans drawn up by an architect friend of mine, went with it. My son went between 2 homes now, and every Sunday night when I dropped him off, I sat in the driveway a little longer than necessary before driving away. I won't romanticize that part. It was hard. It stayed hard for a while. What changed was subtler. In the first year after the divorce, I started noticing how much energy I'd been spending on maintenance. Not the structural kind I was good at, but the kind required to function inside a relationship where you're not entirely wanted. Small emotional labor, preemptive accommodations, the constant background calculation of how to be in a room with her family without triggering something. That weight lifted gradually, the way debt pays down, not all at once, but measurably. Work came back into focus. The restructured company, freed from the legal uncertainty of the divorce, started performing better than it had in 2 years. I hired a project manager I'd been putting off hiring because the business felt too unstable. We landed a municipal contract in late spring that I'd been working toward for 3 years. My team was good, and I'd been too distracted to tell them that clearly enough. I made a point of changing that. My son adjusted. Kids are more adaptable than adults give them credit for. Mostly because they haven't yet learned to catastrophize the way adults do. He was 7. He liked Legos and soccer and a specific brand of fruit snacks that I kept fully stocked. He spent weekends with me, and we built routines that were ours. Saturday morning hikes when the weather allowed, pizza and movie Fridays, Sunday breakfasts where he was allowed to pick whatever cereal he wanted regardless of sugar content, a rule his mother did not share and that he therefore treasured. The fallout from the other side took longer to materialize and arrived the way my father had always told me consequences arrived, quietly, without announcement, through the same small gaps that let the original betrayal in. The development firm my wife's associate had been running collapsed 11 months after the divorce. A competitor filed a complaint with the state licensing board alleging bid manipulation. I didn't file it. I had considered it, then decided that documentation held in reserve was more useful than documentation spent. Someone else made the complaint, which meant I was nowhere near it. The investigation that followed surfaced procurement irregularities that went beyond anything involving my business. The firm dissolved. The man at the center of it left the state. I heard through mutual industry contacts, not through anything I was tracking. I didn't spend energy tracking it. That was a habit I had worked to break, the impulse to monitor what was happening to people who'd harmed me. It's seductive, that impulse. It masquerades as justice-seeking, but what it actually does is keep you tethered to something that's already over. My brother-in-law called me once, about 14 months after the divorce. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, he got through about 2 sentences of something that was almost an apology before trailing off. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, simply, that I hoped things were going well for him, and I meant it. Not warmly, but I meant it. I had stopped needing him to have suffered. He didn't call again. My wife's mother I have not spoken to since the conference room. I don't expect that to change, and I've made peace with it. There is a version of this story that ends with a scoreboard, with me tallying what she lost and what I kept, and presenting it as evidence of something. I've seen that version in my own head, especially in the first few months, when I was still carrying enough anger to want the accounting to feel satisfying. But the scorecard version is missing the part that actually mattered, The thing I lost in that marriage wasn't the house or the business or the years of work that went into either. What I lost, slowly, quietly, over about 5 years, was my own sense of my own judgment, the confidence that I was reading situations correctly, the trust in my own perception when the people around me kept suggesting, through small persistent pressure, that my perception was wrong. Getting that back had nothing to do with what happened in the conference room. It had to do with the 4 months before that, when I was working through evidence, making decisions, and watching my own thinking be correct in a way that could be verified. That's the part I wish someone had told me earlier. You do not recover your self-respect by winning. You recover it by deciding to stop treating your own judgment as inferior to the approval of people who do not have your interests in mind. The loudest man in the room is almost always losing. My grandfather was right, but the quieter version of that truth is the one I had to learn myself. The man who stays quiet to keep the peace, who makes himself smaller to fit inside a space that was always too narrow for him. That man isn't wise. He's just waiting. I was waiting for 11 years. I'm not waiting anymore. My son is 9 now. Last spring, we drove up to the Smokies for a weekend. Not the old property, a different place entirely. One I chose because it had a good hiking trail and a porch and no history attached to it. We made sandwiches the night before and packed them in a cooler, and we drove up on a Saturday morning, with the windows down and the radio on something he picked. On the trail, he found a walking stick that he decided was exactly the right weight, and he carried it the whole 4 miles without putting it down once. At the turnaround point, we sat on a rock above the tree line and ate our sandwiches and looked out over about 100 miles of Tennessee ridgeline. He said, "Dad, is this what the whole state looks like from up high?" I said, "More or less." He thought about that for a second. "I want to see more of it." "We will," I said, and I knew, sitting there with a cheese sandwich and a 9-year-old kid who was deciding what he wanted to see, that I had not lost anything that mattered. Not permanently, not in the ways that count. I had walked into that conference room expecting to be diminished one final time. Instead, I found something I hadn't gone there looking for, the end of a long performance. The last day of pretending that a version of my life designed by other people's expectations was the one I actually wanted. My father drove back to Knoxville the next morning. Before he left, he stood at my front door and looked at me for a moment the way he sometimes does, assessing, the way he'd assess a job site at the end of the day. "You good?" he said. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." He clapped me once on the shoulder, got in his truck, drove away, and I stood in the doorway of a house that was mine alone now, with coffee going cold in my hand, and a Tuesday stretching out in front of me with no performance required. And I thought, this is what feels like when the weight finally comes off. Not loud, not triumphant, just solid and still and mine.